I specialize in making experiences and stories in which the audience is the hero. So I'm really interested in experiences, stories, productions in which the audience is at the heart of it. So they have a leading role. I get really excited when uh, part or a large part of the meaning is created by what the audience does and says and the choices they make. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So my background's in theatre. So I run a theatre company in the UK, and we specialise in making um, really immersive shows. So you walk into a world, you become part of it. The story changes depending on what you and your fellow audiences members do. And the thing that's amazing about it is that it becomes about them. It becomes about these choices they make, the experience they go through, and the story changes depending on who's there, who's part of it, and what they do that night. So, as a theatre maker, when I started making this kind of work, I was really inspired by all the things that are going on right now. Anything from video games to VR and immersive stuff everywhere. But I also look back into the history of theatre, and one of the streams that I was really interested in and got really inspired by is Commedia dell'arte. So this is early 16th century Italy. You have these traveling troupes of theatre makers, and Commedia dell'arte means theatre of the professionals. So this is the first time where people went, let's make some money with this. So these are traveling troupes, and you know the mask stuff, you know all the characters. They were archetypes, and they played with that. But very quickly, they figured out that the route to success was having three layers present, which in essence was spectacle. So you better rehearse, you better have something up your sleeve which you pre-created and you rehearsed to death, and there was trickery involved and maybe fireworks, and it was amazing and it blew everyone's mind. And that was the authored bit that they really worked on really hard. And then the second bit was they created space within these preset plays where they went out the day before. They sort of rocked up to a market square, they set up shop, and they would go out into the town and figure out what was going on. So have these sort of holes in the play which they could fill with local gossip. So if the mayor was having an affair with the baker's wife and everyone sort of knew about it, they could make that part of the show and start alluding to it, and everyone knew what was going on. And it made it personal, it made it of here, it made it of now, it made a connection between the entire audience and the cast. So they created space in the show for that. And then the third thing that they did, but it was very well organized, was improvise. So if it started to rain, the rain became part of it. If there was a fight breaking out because 16th century Italy, we're in a market square, that could happen, that became part of it. And they responded to it and made it part of the show. But they have very elaborate cueing systems to go from one setting into the other, how to layer those different ways of making work. Again, something really pre-authored, something that they went out to fish for in the town they were at, and something that's improvised, completely responsive to what was happening. So they created these structures that allowed those three ways of creating stories to coexist. So for me, that started to have a real overlap when I started looking at how do you create a story, a show, whether it's a live show or something that's partly online and partly in the real world or completely online. How do you create a show that is both a piece of work that's good, it's a piece of work that's authored, that is made, that's created by someone who's worked on it, that's very clever, but also has space to fish in the audience response and know what they're looking for, and create space for meaning to emerge in the dialogue between audience and the piece or the makers. And then thirdly, just be footloose enough to just respond if something really awesome happens right now. So I started trying to figure out, like, how do you make that? How do you create a structure that is closed enough to be a piece of work, authored enough to be good, but also open enough to create space for the audience and respond to whatever is going on. So that's what I'm interested in. So I stole some of their techniques. The other place I looked at is jazz. So you have, Springtime in Paris. Everyone knows Paris, but whichever band that plays on whichever given night, they'll riff, they'll go off book, they play together and they bring it together, and it will always be recognizably Springtime in Paris. But it's also of the moment, and it's there, and you have to be there to be part of it. And I think for me, when stories can do that as well, I get really excited. So for me, that has to do with a couple of things. Is the structure needs to be interesting enough, and the story needs to be interesting enough, but the story also needs to be open. And that's where there's a real sort of tension there, and a real sort of thing to get your mind around, that rather than creating a story that runs from A to Z and you know what's going to happen, you create a framework in which the story happens, and you might know what you're working towards, but there are also spaces where you're actively encouraging the audience to become part of it. And I think this kind of work becomes really good if it's not a tag on, but it's integral, and where the meaning of the piece itself, the moments that we all love in stories, which are heart-rendering and heroic or anti-heroic, the things where it gets personal and beautiful, where our little hearts stop for a beat, if that can be generated by the audience because of the framework that you've created, I think that's where I get really excited. So it means a mixture of open and closed structures. It means thinking very carefully about the emotional arc of the audience as well as the emotional arc of your characters. So for me, I always work with the audience as a character as well, and plan out their journey in the same way you would plot out a character journey. But it's also about a behavioral journey. So what do you want your audience to do? So there's the emotion. What do you want them to feel? And we all know that. But it's also about action. The audience needs to do something. They have to have meaningful action in which they become creative and creators, and where they start contribute to the story and become part of the story, and do something that's not just left or right, blue or red pill. It becomes a moment of truth, of character development for the audience. So it becomes a very different power dynamic, and I think a very different relationship you have with your audience. It's you still have hyper-authored bits, because otherwise it's just chat. Like the hyper-authored bits are the bits where you push the story forward, where things happen. But there's also slightly unauthored bits. But it's not about giving your audience complete freedom. It's the sense of freedom. It's the sense of responding to, giving them something that they'll respond to, in the same way that you give a character an obstacle to overcome. You give the audience an obstacle to overcome. But you figure out in your making process of what the obstacle needs to be shaped as, so that you can, so there's only a series of journeys they can take. So one breakthrough for me very much was when I started thinking about where the value of the audience is. And I think it is in deliberation. So the most boring thing is an endlessly branching narrative. Blue pill, red pill, great, lovely, next thing. So the choice moment becomes the moment of agency, the moment where the audience becomes super active, and this is their role. Where actually in life, I think it's a discussion about the blue and the red pill, and oh my God, if I take the red pill, then maybe this will happen, but also this could happen. Oh my God, what should we do? Oh God, the blue pill is so far. It's the search for the answer. So for me, I became really interested in having is creating space for the audience before the choice moments, and the choice almost becoming an afterthought. Actually, the space of the audience is the deliberation. It is Hamlet's to be or not to be, that is the question. You want the monologue, you don't want just the question and then the Hamlet going, actually, I'm going with not to be. That's not where beauty and meaning lies. So as a maker, I started creating structures where there's a limited amount of choices, but how you get there is amazing. So, for example, a couple of years ago, we toured a show called Early Days of a Better Nation, which is a show in which the audience becomes the interim government of a fictional nation. The country's in ruins. They're in different divisions. There's a whole narrative there. They negotiate with World Council. There's a live media reporting on what they are doing and stirring it a bit as well. And you get reporting from the country. So they're in this pressure cooker, and together they reinvent what a country would look like if they were in charge. It's very much what should a nation look like? Where do we want to go? How do we want to live together show. So one of the things that can happen in that show is that the audience can start a revolution. Now, there are basically only two ways this story can go. It has a revolution or it doesn't have a resolution. So as a maker, I only have to make revolution or not revolution. However, creating a journey towards that in where the audience can choose or not choose to do that, there are different reasons to overthrow the current structure, and there are different reasons to not do that. There can be a charismatic rebel that pulls the whole audience with them and revolution happens, or it could be an uncharismatic one and he doesn't quite get the audience with them, so sort of fizzles out. Maybe there's a whole big debate between the audience and they decide one or the other, or they just never really get their act together. There are so many ways in which that revolution can happen or not happen, and that's what's interesting, not whether the revolution happens or not. It's almost an afterthought. The fact that that route is open to them and that there are so many reasons to do or not to do, to be or not to be, that's really interesting. So for me, when I start thinking about where audience creates meaning, it's not in choice, it's the period before the choice that's really interesting. So creating space for your audience to be meaningful, to be vocal about why rather than just what, is where really beautiful narratives that are co-created by your audience emerge. I think the other thing that I think is really vital when you start thinking about this work is how you think about the relationship between you or the piece, and the team or the piece, and the audience. Like, what does that look like? Because if you want your audience to become part of it and you want them to be beautiful, that means you want them to give something of themselves to the piece. You want them to reveal something of themselves or do something which is out of the ordinary. These are heightened circumstances, so this is the time to step up, become the hero or to become the villain, to be someone in this situation that's unique and unlike normal life. So when I start creating a piece, I think very deeply about where the places are where I think beauty can emerge from the audience. So where is that spot to be heroic? How does an audience member actually lead a revolution? What does that look like? How does an audience self-sacrifice itself for this fictional nation? What could that look like? So I think very carefully through the actions and through the kinds of reasonings people can bring to it. And that bit is never in the beginning. That's near the end. That's where the big stuff happens. The big stuff happens somewhere 3/4 in. So if you want the audience to be ready for that and be with you and be immersed enough and be part of this story and have been invested, you have to give them agency beforehand, because you can't go from cold to hot, and you have to make it easy for them to go on a journey with you so that they are ready to step up. So I often think about interaction as gifting. So when an audience member gives me or the piece something, I will give them something bigger back. So in the beginning, it's their tiny exchanges. The old street theatre trick, and once you know it, you'll see it everywhere. If you see a street theatre trick who wants the audience to become a little bit more engaged, they'll give something to someone to hold, because you can't do that wrong. You'll just get it, and you're now holding, I don't know, whatever, the rose. But if you then go, oh, and what's your name? It becomes easy to say your name. And then they go, okay, come on up, sir, and stand on this. And you slowly bring people into an experience. So you do that through action. So you make the actions very small. You make the reward bigger. You know, what's your name? So, massive applause. And obviously, these are like very sort of basic street theatre examples. But if you think about narrative interaction in the same way, you start building an audience that comes in essence, relatively cold, most of them, and sort of bringing them in almost, I always think about it as a little step ladder. So one step at a time, bring them up to the level where they start surprising themselves. So I think thinking about what they are giving you and how you repay them for the gift they are giving to the piece, and the payment of becoming part of the creation, I think is really important and exciting, especially at moments when there is a real personal investment, when they make themselves a bit vulnerable, when there's an emotional risk for them to reveal themselves, because we all know that that's where the beauty lies, where someone all of a sudden, just from the heart, makes or creates or says or writes something so beautiful that as a maker, it breaks your heart. I think for me, that's why I make this work. I think it's the beauty of it is that the audience will co-create the work with you. And it means that your own work will start surprising you, and your own work will start breaking your heart in a way that's really hard to do when you wrote it yourself. But if you see someone else sort of emerge and blossom in it, it just is beautiful. It's also the downside that your own work will start surprising you. So when I make work, I tend to work really iteratively and do little tests and see where, I call it where the eyes go on, where I see that they're actually the moments where that emotional engagement actually happens, where people start opening up. What are the moments where people get really excited and they just need to be more part of it and go further in it, and they just have to become part of it. I think that's really exciting. I think once you've got this, when you have your audience really engaged and they're starting to contribute, they're starting to show something of themselves, and you have these beautiful highlights, I think when you get towards the end of your piece, start reflecting that back. You need to tell the story of them, the story of your audience. What did they do? What did they create? What was beautiful and emotional about it? So Chrissy asked us to give you all an activity. So what I like you to do in whatever you're making next is to start thinking about, you'll be thinking about what you're creating yourself already, but I'd like you to start thinking about moments which you can create where you know you'll want something from your audience, something that you can bring back towards the end, and possibly moments where you improvise. But genuinely, those moments where the Commedia dell'arte people go fishing for the affair between the mayor and the baker's wife, like who's most scandalous right now. Know what you're fishing for in your project. Create spaces where audiences start giving it to you, and then create space in the ending where you reflect that back. So find a space for your audience to be creative or heroic within the narrative, and find a way to reflect it back to them as part of the ending of your piece. That's the activity.